Hello everybody, and welcome to another edition of Aquarium Online Academy. My name is Amanda and I'm coming to you live from the Aquarium of the Pacific in Long Beach, California. I happen to be, looking like I'm standing in front of our Blue Cavern exhibit here, one of our exhibits at the aquarium. You're looking at the view of one of our webcams. And my friend Erin is on the other side of the camera who's controlling all the images that you will be seeing behind me. And as we explore the kelp forest a little bit more. So we're going to be talking today about the kelp forest and conservation and what the aquarium and scientists are doing to help conserve the animals in this amazing environment. Now this is a pretty interesting habitat and it's very important and it's very unique for us here in Southern California that we live in a place that has kelp forest communities, because there are many places in the world that cannot support a kelp forest ecosystem. And one of the important reasons we have them here in Southern California is because of the water temperature. Kelp forests require specific water temperatures, and if it gets too warm or too cold for that, those kelp forests are not going to survive. So let's first look at what a kelp forest is and what kelp is and understand it a little bit more, and then we can understand how they affect the organisms around them. So if we look at this particular exhibit here, you can see we have some long kelp that is extending up to the surface of the water coming from down here. It's anchored at the bottom. Now, as we have our program today, I invite you to participate along by texting in any questions that you might have or any observations that you're making as we talk together to this number, area code 562-286-1838, if you want to text in any live questions. If you're watching this program at a later time on our YouTube channel, you are also welcome to email any questions that you might have using the live@lbaop.org email address that you see at the bottom of your screen. So either way, you're invited to participate along with us, and we're happy to answer any questions you have. So let's look again at this kelp. What is kelp? What kinds of things do you know about kelp already? What type of organism is it, and how does it grow? Well, here we have a look at a natural kelp forest out in the ocean. And what kinds of things do you notice? What stand out to you as you look at this particular video? Obviously, this is a lot of kelp, so each one of these long things you're seeing, these long strands, are, is an organism. It's a living organism called kelp, but what is it? It's obviously not an animal. It looks much more like a plant, doesn't it? What kinds of things make it look like a plant to you? Could it be the color that you're seeing? Does the structure remind you of other plants that you've seen? I tend to think that way. However, it's actually not a plant even. It's something a little bit different called an algae. So kelp itself is considered an algae, but it has a lot of similarities to plants that we would think of on land. Now, if you think about plants on land and you start at the bottom of the plant and you think about the ground and underground, what do plants use? What do you see at the bottom of a plant? How are they holding themselves in the ground? And of course, they're using it for getting nutrients. Well, if you're thinking of roots, that's what I'm thinking of too. So plants have roots that help them to hold themselves in place. But kelp doesn't have a root system, but they have something that looks kind of similar to it. And it's at the bottom. Now, I don't have a great example of one here. I'm going to put it under my document camera and maybe you can see it a little bit better. It kind of looks like just a big ball of sticks. But we'll see if we can let you see this. And if we can get it in, great. If not, we can continue looking at this kelp and we can imagine what's at the bottom of the kelp. Here we have. Here's the holdfast. So this is kind of a dried out example of what it looks like at the bottom of kelp. Now it's called a holdfast because it is not actually a root system where it's drawing nutrients in from the soil. It's just using it to hold itself in place. So it is holding onto a rock and then anchoring itself. So it's not just floating all over the ocean. Because as we were looking at that kelp, did you notice any movement? You see how it was kind of swaying in the water? Well, if it wasn't anchored onto something with the holdfast, it would just be floating all over the ocean and it wouldn't be able to stay in one place to create a habitat. And if you think about one tree, in a place it's just a tree, but if you put a lot of trees all around it, you create a habitat called a forest. So Kelp by itself isn't going to create a forest, but if there's a lot of other kelp around it, it creates a forest. So this part of the kelp, the holdfast at the very bottom, is very important for that. Now I have an example of what kelp looks like. This is just a model, but down here at the bottom would be where that holdfast would be. Our little model has kind of lost some of it as an example, but this would be a tiny little holdfast. It would hold itself in place, and then the kelp just kind of grows up, and it does look a lot like a plant. This long stem right here that you see kind of reminds me of a stem of a plant. It's actually called a stipe. And so this stipe is not as stiff as a tree or other plants. It's very, very flexible. And remember how we saw the ocean waves moving? That's important to help it not just break off. If it was very stiff and those ocean waves were strong, they could break this kelp off. So having that flexibility helps it in the ocean and those waves. But what is it that it's using to stay afloat? It doesn't, since it's not stiff. If I was to let go of this, what's going to happen to it? Well, it's just going to fall down to the bottom. But when we were looking at the kelp forest, we didn't see it all just sitting on the bottom. Was it all on the bottom of the ocean floor? Maybe we should look at that again. So as the kelp that we saw in the kelp forest habitat in the ocean is kind of flowing with the ocean, it's not clumped up in the bottom. But you could see when I let it go, it would just go to the bottom. So why is it not just clumped up at the bottom? Do you have any idea? What does this kelp have that might be helping it to reach upward? And why might that be important? Think about the importance of trees and other plants that we've talked about. It's important for us on a daily basis. Can you think of any reason why plants are important for us? What kind of service do they do for us that we need to be able to survive? Can you think of any of those things? I'll let you ponder that for a little while. Because this kelp, this algae in the ocean, does some of that same stuff. So it's one of the reasons why many times plants are green. Those green leaves need something. They're able to do something pretty amazing as long as they are getting energy from the sun. In fact, if we look at this video, do you see evidence of the sun reaching this kelp forest? Yeah, look at all the rays of the sun that are coming down here. And so there's a lot of sunlight in this kelp forest, which is really important because kelp can do something with the sunlight that plants can do with the sunlight. Do you know what it is? There's a special process called photosynthesis. So they actually can take energy from the sun and turn it into food for themselves and also oxygen for fish to breathe in the water or even for us to breathe. So oxygen that's produced in the water by kelp and also little phytoplankton, little tiny organisms in the water, actually they can release that oxygen into the air where we actually benefit from it. In fact, a lot of the oxygen you breathe every day is from the ocean, believe it or not, is produced in the ocean and breathed by us. So kelp forests are important even for us. So we have this algae that's growing and it's reaching up. It needs that sunlight. So how is it reaching up to the very top? Well, if we explore a little bit more closely, if we were to look at this blade of kelp, so it looks like a leaf, but we call it a blade. We would see at the base of the blade of this kelp, they have this little puffy thing right here. We call it a pneumatocyst or an air bladder. Think of it like little floaties. So these little floaties have air in them. And so when you put something that's full of air into the water, what does it do? It floats, of course. So having these little pneumatocysts here in the water helps that kelp to continue to reach up to the surface so they can get all the rays of the sunlight and continue to produce food for itself and oxygen for the other organisms in the water. So the kelp forest habitat is important just for that reason alone. It's creating a lot of oxygen in the water, but it also is creating a habitat that's important for many other animals. Can you think of other ways that the kelp might be important for the animals that live in a kelp forest? Why might living here be beneficial to an animal? Well, we said that obviously they're creating oxygen the animals can use for breathing. It's also creating shelter. It creates shelter, a place for them to hide. Do you think there are animals that might even be hiding in this video that we can't see very well? Of course, kelp is great for providing shelter for animals. Some smaller animals might be living in even the holdfast of the kelp. So the kelp that we were looking at earlier that looked like a big thing of twigs, there are so many little spaces in there that little organisms can hide and live in and thrive in. So the kelp is a habitat and shelter, and it can also provide not just oxygen, but also a source of food for animals. In fact, one animal that feeds on other algae and that lives at the bottom of the kelp forest, we're going to explore it a little bit. Because this kelp forest habitat has different zones in it, different regions. Up at the very top where the kelp grows, when it's getting all that sunlight and the kelp continues to grow, because kelp can grow up to 2 feet in one day. In one 24-hour period, the kelp that you see here could be like another 2 feet taller. It can grow really, really fast. And when it gets to the surface, it doesn't start going up out of the water and going straight up because it doesn't have that stiff stipe or a stem. Instead, that stipe is very flexible and wobbly. So it forms and continues to grow over the surface of the water, creating a canopy. And there are a lot of animals that live in the canopy of the kelp. There are some animals that live in the mid-water area of the kelp forest, and some animals that live at the bottom, what we call the holdfast area of the kelp. So let's explore these different regions of the kelp and see what kind of organisms might be living there. Well, first of all, at the bottom, there is a very interesting type of animal. It's a type of invertebrate. In fact, there are many invertebrates that live at the bottom of a kelp forest habitat in the holdfast area. So invertebrates are animals without backbones. But this particular animal does have a very hard shell to protect itself. Now, it's not very obvious. If you look at it, you might not notice anything. You might not even realize it's an animal. It looks kind of like a big rock, but it actually has a very strong foot that it uses to hold on to that rock. We're going to show you a picture of what that animal is and see if you can identify what this animal is and where it is in our picture. I'm going to try to step to the side. It's not in this particular exhibit, but we're going to see if we can find you this interesting invertebrate with a shell. So it's considered a mollusk. Now, do you see an animal in this picture? Like I said, it looks like a rock. But can you tell what we're looking at? And I am curious. If anyone happens to know what this animal is, go ahead and text it in to 562-286-1838. Now, if you're not able to text, you can go ahead and shout it out of the screen. But I realize many of you might not be familiar with this particular animal because it's not a common one. You don't usually see this in drawings or cartoons of animals. Maybe you're familiar with SpongeBob. Maybe you know who Patrick is. You maybe know what different types of animals might look like if you draw them as a cartoon. But I don't know that I've seen too many people draw this particular animal as a cartoon before. Unless you've seen one of our videos that our Pacific pals have put out, then you may have seen this. We do have a really cool music video about this animal. So I'm going to wait. And as we're waiting to see if anybody knows what this animal might be, I want to point out that there's more of one of this animal here. Let's see if you can identify it. So right here, here's one. And then right up above it, there's another one. And then even on this side, here, we get kind of a side view. There's one here. And then do you see right here? There's also another one. And there's probably some others in the shadows that I can't see very well. But all of these are invertebrates with a hard shell, and they're holding on really tightly to this rock. And if you see that little bit of black around the outside edge, that little bit of black is part of their foot, really, that they're using to hold on. But then they also have these little things that stick out. We call them sensory tentacles, that they can kind of get information about the world around them. Now, they do have two little eyes, which are very cute on the bottom, that we can't see very well in this picture, but they use this shell around them for protection. In fact, I'll give you another view of one over at my document camera. And, the coloring is a little bit different on this one. It's cleaned up a little bit from the picture that you see in front of you here, and it's not underwater, so you can see a little bit better. Let me see, is my light? Let me try to make this a little bit brighter. let me try. Oops. Yes, where did that go? There we go. Now it should be much easier for people to see. Okay, so here's another picture of this organism with this shell, and it's also got these funny little holes in it. And these holes are how you can identify this animal. It's got these little holes that go around one side, one edge of it. And then as they grow, they start to fill in the holes. So do you see the evidence of these little bumps right here? These used to be little holes, and then as this animal grows, or as it grew, it filled those holes in and created newer, bigger holes for it. Why do you think an animal would want holes in their shell? What do you think they would use it for? Well, I'm going to go ahead and tell you the name of this animal is an abalone. So you're looking at an abalone shell. Have you ever heard of an abalone before? Like, oh yeah, I've heard of it, but I didn't know what it was. Well, now you know. It's a type of a mollusk, a soft-bodied animal with a hard shell. But look at the inside of this shell. Isn't it beautiful? You can still see, you can even see the shadows down here of the light coming through the holes over here. So it's got the holes you can see, but it's got a beautiful shiny inside of that shell. Now, abalone are very popular for eating. A lot of people like to eat abalone, and they also would use their shells for jewelry. And so what happened is if you have this thing that's really good to eat, well, a lot of people want to go out and try to fish it for themselves and collect them from the ocean and eat them. Of course, right? If something tastes good. Well, the problem is abalone hold on really, really tight to the rocks, and it can take a lot of work to get them off. And it was really hard for people to hold their breath, go down to the bottom of the kelp forest and get them off and be able to have success with that. But as soon as scuba gear got introduced and people were able to stay underwater longer and try to get those abalone off, what ended up happening is abalone became overfished, which means more people were taking them out of the ocean than the abalone would get a chance to reproduce for themselves and kind of repopulate that area of the ocean that they were being taken from. And so with all of these abalone disappearing and not having enough big abalone around to make more little baby abalones, our abalone population started to go down. But then there's something else that really affected that, and their numbers were affected by an introduced abalone. So something else came into the environment and ended up spreading a sickness throughout all the abalone population, and it nearly wiped out our abalone numbers off our coast. And these are organisms that live in the kelp forest. But what did scientists do? Well, they said, we have a problem. How can we help restore these abalone numbers? And how can we at the aquarium, how can we be involved in help? Well, we got together with scientists and we started to raise abalone babies. So we raised abalone from a type of abalone called a white abalone. And they would create babies at the aquarium that we could raise. And then we worked with other scientists in other aquariums and other labs, and were able to create so many new baby white abalone. Then we were able to release them out into the ocean and help repopulate some abalone areas where their numbers could increase again. So the aquarium has been a part. Can you hear me okay? Okay, so the aquarium has been a part of restoring abalone numbers off our coast here in Southern California, and hoping to see another nice balance in the ecosystem in the kelp forest habitat again. So we made sure that we had the types of food that the abalone would need when they were out in the area. The aquarium didn't just say, let's have some abalone babies and then put them out in the ocean. It took a long time to have success with the process that we used, and also be able to make sure that when we put them in the ocean, we were putting them in a safe place for them. We needed to look. We had our aquarists that would go out diving in certain areas, and they would look for what areas are there good food sources for the abalone? What types of food sources do the abalone at these different stages like and seem to prefer? How can we make sure that they're not going to be eaten up by predators? So how many predators of the abalone might be in that area? And they just made sure that there was shelter for them and the substrates that they need, the type of surfaces to hold onto. And so we were able to provide research and feedback to organizations like NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the groups that were working to save these white abalone. And we have had success at letting them out into the ocean. So that's some really exciting work that's happened with abalone in the kelp forest, but that's at the bottom of the kelp forest at the holdfast area. If you move up the kelp forest, you might notice other organisms that live in the midwater, like giant sea bass. You may have noticed them at the beginning of our program in our blue cavern exhibit. And you may have seen these really, really big fish. Well, those big fish, here's a picture of one right here. They can actually grow up to 500 pounds. They can get very, very large. And they were very abundant off our coast here in Southern California and living in the kelp forest. So you can see the kelp right behind it here in this particular photo. But what happened is, again, they were becoming overfished, because if a fisherman could catch a fish that was 500 pounds, think of all the food they could get from it and how many people they could feed and how much money they might make for a prize if they win a fishing contest with this really big fish. So what happened is so many people started fishing for this fish because it's a very slow swimming fish and very curious. So it would come right on up to people. So it was really easy to find. But then with so many people fishing for the giant sea bass, their numbers started to go down too. And then we didn't have as many big fish that were able to repopulate. And so the numbers remained really low until people realized this. And they said, we need to protect these sea bass. And we need to put some sort of regulations in place to make sure that people aren't taking them. And so they became protected. And so with that protection, we've now started to see giant sea bass numbers come back. And we've been starting to see some slightly larger ones inhabit our kelp forests in the areas off our coast here in Southern California again. So that's another positive story. Now this picture right here, does this look like the giant sea bass we just saw before? No, there's some obvious differences. This one has a very different color to it, but this is what giant sea bass look like as babies. And this one in particular has a name. This giant sea bass is named Utaka. And why do I know that? Well, this is one that was raised right here at the Aquarium of the Pacific. We were the first public aquarium to have success at breeding and raising a giant sea bass. This is one of the babies that came from those giant sea bass you were looking at in our exhibit earlier. And so this little baby giant sea bass we raised here, and because we had success raising it, we were able to have success helping some other scientists and some other aquariums raise more giant sea bass babies that were then also able to be reintroduced back into the population here off our coast of Southern California. And what's really exciting about giant sea bass babies is you'll notice that they do look different as they're younger with a brighter color, the bright orange color, and then that fades as they get bigger. But do you notice how they still have these spots all over their bodies? Well, these spots, scientists have learned, help identify individual fish. And so they can take a picture of these spots and study them, and they can catalog them in the same ways that we can do with whales. So we can take pictures of the backs of blue whales or orca whales, and we can actually compare and contrast and find individuals. It's kind of like having special fingerprints. So their spots are like a fingerprint all over their body that identify individual fish. So we can actually track some of the sea bass that have been released out into the ocean by using spots. And if you are ever a scuba diver out in the ocean, and you happen to see a giant sea bass and you can get a picture of it with a cool underwater camera, if you have one of those, that can be really important information. That can be shared with scientists using a program called Spotting Sea Bass, or Spotting Giant Sea Bass. It's a program where anyone, we call it a citizen science program, can be a part of contributing information and data, because that picture is information, it's data, that can be shared to figure out what individual that is. And we can track them better, learn more about their habitats, learn how they're doing, see how much they've grown, where they're traveling to, and we can learn more about ways that we could help save these animals and get a better understanding of what their population is like and how they're interacting with the kelp forest habitat. So the aquarium's been really excited to be a part of growing giant sea bass, reintroducing them back out into the ocean, and also telling people that they can get involved themselves. If you ever happen to see a giant sea bass, make sure you get a picture of it. Try to get both sides too, so we can look at the spots, and then maybe that information will be cataloged to help a scientist learn more about the ocean and the giant sea bass, which is really exciting. So those are mid-water animals. Now, of course, up at the canopy, a lot of times in the kelp forest, you might see some other really cute animals frolicking around. They are probably one of the cutest animals we happen to have here at the aquarium. They're covered in fur. They like to float on their backs. Do you know what animal I'm talking about? If you're thinking of a sea otter, you're correct. Now, the sea otters are a very important animal in the kelp forest. Let me get out of the way so you can just see this one, this hungry otter that's eating its food. You can see how it's floating on its back, and there's, this sort of kelp all around it. Now, these animals actually eat things that are found at the bottom of the kelp forest. So even though they spend most of their time at the surface of the kelp forest, they rely on invertebrates like sea stars, even abalone, sea urchins. Sea urchins are a favorite thing of theirs that live down at the bottom. So they live all throughout the kelp forest, using it for protection for them. They'll even wrap themselves up in the kelp when they sleep so that they don't float away, especially important for their babies. So the baby sea otters will be wrapped up in kelp by the mom while the mom goes off and does her hunting and comes back to her baby. But when they go hunting, they go down, grab their food, and bring it up and eat it. And I said one of their favorite things is a sea urchin. Now, do you know what a sea urchin looks like? Sea urchins are pretty cool, and they're kind of spiky. It doesn't look like something you would normally want to grab and hold on to real tight, but sea otters are pretty careful about it, and they have an unusual way of helping them eat this food. They will grab a tool like a rock, and they'll even use these special armpit pockets. They have these little pockets underneath their armpits, which have extra folds of their skin and fur in it that they can actually put their rock in if they grab a rock, and they can hold on to the sea urchin with their little paws, and then they can come up and they can crack that urchin open, and they love to eat it. Now, the interesting thing, though, about these cute, fluffy sea otters and their appetite for urchins is it was really important about these urchins, or it was very important that these sea otters were eating the urchins, because look at this urchin right here. Here's a purple sea urchin. Notice what it's sitting on top of. We've got a nice view of the blade and the pneumatocyst, the floaty of the kelp right here. And the reason why this urchin's on top of it is because they like to eat kelp. They love to eat kelp. They actually have a mouth on the underside of their body, and they use these teeth to eat the kelp and scrape algae off. But these, if you look at their body, these are not floaters. They do not have fins to help them swim through the water like fish do. So they are sitting at the bottom of the kelp forest in that holdfast area, in that part of the habitat. And so if this urchin wants to eat some kelp, it's going to look for the kelp on the bottom. And if that kelp is all growing up tall with those pneumatocysts, it's going to be stuck eating the holdfast. So if the urchin comes along and he decides to eat the holdfast of the kelp, what's going to happen to the rest of that kelp? It's going to be eaten off and it's going to float away. So if the urchin's down here eating the kelp floats away, we're going to start losing our habitat. But the otters were around, so they were able to keep that population of sea urchins in check so that our kelp forest remained nice and healthy. Now, that was true a long time ago when we had lots of sea otters in the water. But when they became popular for hunters who liked them for their fur, and they thought, well, sea otter fur is good for keeping sea otters warm, maybe it'll be good for keeping me warm, and they decided to make coats out of it, well, the sea otter numbers and their population went down. So as the sea otter numbers went down, guess what happened to the sea urchin numbers? They went up. And so as urchin numbers went up, what do you think happened to the kelp forest areas? Well, those started to disappear. So we found that having sea otters around was an important thing, and we call them a keystone species because once we took the sea otters out of the environment, out of that habitat, the ecosystem, everything got a little bit crazy. So every part of all these animals in the ecosystem are really important to keep that ecosystem healthy and to keep other populations in check so that we have great diversity. And the aquarium has even been a part of helping sea otters to grow. We've been able to raise, or we're partnering with Monterey the Aquarium and some wonderful people who have success at raising sea otters and then being able to have them go back out into the ocean again. So it's a program we're really excited about using you can see these cute little baby otters here, that we provide a surrogate mom, another otter, to kind of teach them how to be otters so that they can then be otters out in the ocean and not have to rely on people to take care of them. So there are a lot of exciting things going on here at the Aquarium of the Pacific for conservation and helping the animals that live in the kelp forest habitat. So I hope you've enjoyed learning about that with me today. And if you have any other questions or you'd like more information on how maybe you could be involved in supporting conservation efforts, please contact us at live@lbaop.org. We would love to hear from you. And teachers, if you happen to be watching right now and you have information on how many students are joining us today, we'd love to have you just text in those numbers for us, just for the live program at 562-286-1838 so we know how many people we're reaching. But thank you to all of you for joining us today and have a wonderful day. Bye.